So I'm Joe Pistritto. Well, yeah, it doesn't have to be that dark, right? That's better, yeah.
That looks good.
That's probably good. So I've been licensed since 1983. I've lived in California since 1990. Until May of last year, I worked at Google in the data centers group at Google. And I retired in May, and this deployment opportunity appeared in September. So it's one of the first things I actually did while I was retired, was go to Puerto Rico. I had never been to Puerto Rico before this happened. I'd never been to any Caribbean island. I did grow up on the East Coast, but I somehow skipped the expression of going to the Caribbean while I was on the East Coast. So this was all new to me when I went there. So the first thing is, what happened in Puerto Rico? Many people in the United States do not realize that Puerto Rico is in the United States. There were people on the plane with us that did not realize that Puerto Rico, that were flying from Atlanta to Puerto Rico, that did not realize that it was still in the United States. So it is an American territory. It has been an American territory since 1898, I think, when we acquired it from the Spanish as a result of the Spanish-American War. So everybody who lives in Puerto Rico is an American citizen, which means they can move to the United States, which in fact is happening as a result of this disaster in Puerto Rico. But not everybody, but a lot of people. So this is a NOAA infrared picture of the hurricane actually on top of Puerto Rico. The black thing in the middle is the eye. This little outline here is the island of Puerto Rico. And then this little island over here on the right-hand side of it is Vieques, which is another island which is considered administratively part of Puerto Rico. The Navy used to bomb that island until fairly recently. Anyway, the eye sort of went across Puerto Rico in this point. This is a Category 5 hurricane. Actually, I believe it was 4 plus when this frame was actually taken. But it was Category 5 when it impacted Puerto Rico. It is the first time that a Category 5 hurricane had hit any part of the United States since Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans 10 years ago. And it was the second Category 5 hurricane to interact with the United States this year, although the other ones did not hit directly. The winds in all that red stuff there in the center, that's the dangerous part of the hurricane, especially this part that's near the eye. That's about 130 mile an hour horizontal velocity wind. It actually gets more intense when it goes over a mountain. When there's a mountain range and the wind goes over the mountain range, it actually kind of focuses on the reverse slope. We did actually see that effect. You could actually look up there and see buildings, like these buildings were okay, these buildings were okay, this building was missing. And you could actually see the effect of wind funneling by which houses were destroyed going down the hill. On reverse slopes. 100%, when we landed in Puerto Rico, 100% of the power was turned off in the island. There was no electricity to anywhere, including the capital, including the airport we were in. There was a generator running the terminal in the airport we were in, which means there was no air conditioning, which turned out to be a critical thing in Puerto Rico in September. A lot of the island was flooded. I actually have a map of the island that shows where some of the other stuff is down. Almost all of the cell sites, cellular telephone sites, were physically destroyed or ran out of power within a couple days of the hurricane. So there was virtually no cellular service. And there was a little bit in San Juan when we got there, but even the bridge that separates San Juan from Rio Pedras, you'd see cars parked along the bridge, and those were people trying to use their cell phones because the stuff on the north side had cellular coverage, and the stuff and Rio Pedras is it's like 2 parts of Sacramento, right? It's really close to the rest of San Juan, but it didn't have any cell service or any power in there. 30 days later, which was about the time that I left the island, 75% of the people in the country still did not have power, and as of last night, 45% still did not have power. And this hurricane hit on September 15th. So that was pretty dramatic. That is a visible light picture of the hurricane. It's a little further from Puerto Rico. In this case, that's the eye right there. Puerto Rico is this thing up in the upper left-hand side. You can see the hurricane is much larger than Puerto Rico. In here, the Puerto Rico is 150 miles long-ish, somewhere around 150 miles. But the hurricane was over 300 miles wide, and it was virtually centered on Puerto Rico when it went over. The storm tracks are these ones over here on the left. This is the previous hurricane, which was Hurricane Irma, which made a direct hit on the U.S. Virgin Islands while a Category 5 hurricane. And then almost parallel track of Hurricane Maria, which is the one that hit Puerto Rico. There were a number of people who lost their power in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Irma and had not gotten it back before Hurricane Maria hit. So they actually had an extra 2 weeks of no power going on there. So when we got there, almost everything was broken in the island. This is actually the map that was on the wall every day in the American Red Cross headquarters. And every one of these little stickies represents something going on in one of those places. The little red and blue lines are roads that are closed or destroyed in the center. When you hear about the center of Puerto Rico has a lot of, like the mountainous areas of Puerto Rico, that's mostly this area here in the middle of the island, because the island is beaches on both the north and south side, and then it kind of builds up to a ridge that's about 2,000 feet high in the center of the island. There's a few places higher than that. But yeah, so almost everything was broken, and no one was prepared for this, right? The people in Puerto Rico weren't prepared for this. The government in Puerto Rico wasn't prepared for this. The Red Cross wasn't prepared for this, which is why we were there. The FEMA was not prepared for this because, unlike in the United States, the rest of the United States, where FEMA has a lot of pre-positioned supplies and stuff like that in different places, because they know like hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast every year, and so they pre-position some stuff 100 or 200 miles from the Gulf Coast so that they could put it on trucks and get it there. There's none of that stuff in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is 1,300 nautical miles from the nearest point in the United States. And the result of that is it's not easy to get things there when you need to in a hurry. There's actually a map of Puerto Rico, and it shows kind of the parts of the island that were affected by different things. The green path here is where the eye went. As a matter of fact, there was a show on television like last night or the night before that actually showed like a bunch of people, like a bunch of destroyed buildings right at the beach. That's actually Humachao, which is right here, which I probably said wrong. And we were in terms of like places that I visited while I was in Puerto Rico, we were staying up in San Juan, which was the staging area for everybody. When President Trump went to Puerto Rico, he only went to San Juan. I think they flew him over some part of the island because we saw them doing practice runs of helicopters over the area he was going to fly over a couple days beforehand. He visited, I think the 5th or 6th day I was in Puerto Rico was when he came. And we stayed way out of San Juan when that was going on, because they closed like a big part of the city. There was only like a very small part of the city that was actually working at that time, and it was essentially all closed because the president was coming to there. And he went to the convention center, which was where the FEMA headquarters was in San Juan, which is about as far north in Puerto Rico as you can possibly get in there, and it was the best preserved area of the country in there. So this area here had a lot of damage from wind. The areas over on the west side of the island had a lot of flooding because these mountains, all these rivers, we were in Utuado, which is that town right there where that arrow goes to. And the river was 40 feet high going through the center of the town. When you looked out at the buildings on either side there was a big empty area where the river was because all those buildings had been completely destroyed. And there was nothing there. And then you'd see buildings that looked like they were in Berlin after World War II because the faces had collapsed off the buildings and the floors were washed out and stuff like that. And that went back probably several hundred feet on either side of where the river was. There wasn't actually much water in the river when we were there because most of it had run out by then. But they had 40-foot high floods going through the center of a populated city. Wow. So I think there were 10 or 12 people, they said, that they were confirmed dead right there at that spot we were at. Laris, which is this other one that I have a blue arrow going to, also had that same problem because they have a mountain river that goes through there. So a lot of the mountains, there was so much water coming off the mountains because they had like 24 inches of rain or something during a hurricane. when you get that much rain, it doesn't ever, none of it soaks in, right? Basically, it all runs downhill, and your river that's normally, 10 feet deep or something like that goes up by 30 feet when that happens, and it takes out bridges, and anything in its path is basically gone because that much water is very destructive. Out here on the west side, this is kind of like Rincon and some of this area, but as a matter of fact, the stuff right near this river here we visited, that area is kind of marshy. It's very flat and marshy out there. And so a lot of that stuff, the water just went up like 10 feet, which was basically up to the top of the first floor of the buildings that were in that area. So everybody had to go get on their roof when that happened. The islands that we were talking about are out here on the western side, or the eastern side of the island. Vieques, which is this big one that was mostly a naval gunnery range at one point, and then Culebra, which is a very small island on which there are no cars. It's a kind of a resort island, and they only have golf carts there. And we actually had ham radio operators go to both of those islands as part of there. As an example of something that actually happened, this is a place where I actually went. We were in Cayey province, which is sort of the middle and going towards the south side of Puerto Rico. This is what an FAA Doppler control tower looks like. This is what the one in Puerto Rico looked like after the hurricane. The big dome, there were no pieces of that dome to be found. We walked all around the thing looking for a piece and could not find any. And the radar itself was, the antenna was heavily damaged by the wind. This is an area that probably got 130 mile an hour winds. So we know that interestingly enough, I saw almost no collapsed towers. So the towers were all okay. It's the stuff on the towers that tended to break. So we know those domes are not good for 130 mile an hour winds now. So how did the ham radio operators actually get there, and what was the ham radio deployment like? So this is actually a picture of all of us. This is most of the operators. This is the day we arrived in Atlanta. That's in the Sheraton Hotel in Atlanta. The Red Cross had basically taken over the Sheraton, and they were using it to stage all these people. So there were like big rooms with cots in them that everybody was sleeping in, waiting to get on their plane to Puerto Rico. We were only there one day, but some of the Red Cross people were there 4 or 5 days. So what happened was the Red Cross had already deployed to Puerto Rico. They had probably 200 or 300 people in Puerto Rico before we got there. And one of the problems they immediately had was they couldn't talk to anyone. The Red Cross has a lot of technical systems that I'll talk a little bit when I talk about reunification about what they actually do. But everything in the Red Cross is form-based. It is a giant logistics company. You think it has something to do with medicine? It does not. It is mainly a giant logistics operation. And logistics operations operate on paper, right? They have to send forms to each other, whether on physical paper or electronically. And that means they have to be able to talk to each other. So if you want a truck to come out and deliver supplies to a town so that people can get them, you have to there's a form you fill out for that in headquarters, and you give it to somebody in logistics, and they go over to scheduling, and they find out like when's the next time we have a box truck and enough people to get on a box truck, and can the truck get there, and do we know exactly where we're sending it, and do we know who the person is that we're supposed to talk to before we send the truck out there, right? And they do all that stuff in order to try to coordinate. Well, if you don't have any cell phones, none of that works. And they did not have that problem when they did the hurricanes in the U.S. Because a lot of the Red Cross resources, some of these people that were in the Red Cross that were in Puerto Rico had just been in Houston doing a hurricane, or Florida doing a hurricane. Because the pre-Irma, one of those hurricanes that went just north of Puerto Rico, had gone to Florida and done a lot of damage down there. So the Red Cross was all there, right? So these guys were all like, yeah, so we can't get any forms in from the field. So what happened was the Red Cross went to the ARRL, and apparently this had never happened before, at least we were told this, and said, we need ham radio operators so that we can get people so that we can talk, right? And so the ARRL put out a call. It was on, a bunch of amateur radio websites. I saw it on QRZ Now, actually, I think. And it had an email address of a guy up in Newington, Mike Corey, I think, yeah. So I sent him a note and said, well, I just retired. I'm sitting in California. I suppose I could go to Puerto Rico if it's a big deal. And my phone rings 8 minutes later after I sent the email. And I said, wow, I'm not used to getting that kind of response, even when I work at Google. And I was the capacity planner for all of Google. When I would send somebody an email saying, I need to do something, it was really rare that they called me back in 8 minutes to do it. And I said, wow, these guys must be really motivated, right? And sure enough, they were. Turns out they got 450 volunteers. The 22 of us all had the attribute, I believe we all had the attribute that we'd replied like the first day or something like that to the Puerto Rico thing. And so they asked us about 4 or 5 questions, which varied a little bit by person. And they said, oh, okay, that's good. Somebody from the Red Cross will call you back. And because none of us had any Red Cross, there was 1 or 2 people who had Red Cross experience before, but I had nothing. I'd never done anything with the Red Cross other than give blood, right? And so what happened was the Red Cross called us, and then they did a medical check, right? They said, like, do you have any of these conditions, or that sort of thing. And like Puerto Rico, there's no power, right? You're okay with that. It's kind of like camping, right? And we said, yeah, okay. How bad can it be, right? Well, it turns out it can be pretty bad. So the 22 of us got selected, and I think 48 hours after that call, I was on a plane to Atlanta. And they said, you need to be in Atlanta by 3 p.m. on this day, right? And I said, okay. And the Red Cross called up and gave me an airplane ticket. They said, go to the airport, get your ticket, go. And I was like, okay. And they gave us a long list of stuff we had to take with us too. All kinds of stuff. A lot of stuff we didn't actually use that we ended up there. And so everybody had to go to Atlanta, and this was us arriving in Atlanta and trying to figure, like, okay, what do we do now? Because the radio equipment that they told us was going to be there wasn't there yet. But it arrived about an hour after this picture. So why did they pick us? Well, originally, the original mission that they told us we were going to be doing was uploading information into the Red Cross Safe and Well system, which is people in Puerto Rico that they've identified who are okay, and then they put that into their system, and then that results in people in the rest of the world being able to go to a website and type in somebody's name and say, oh yeah, that person reported it okay. So the idea is so that families in the rest of the world will actually know that the people, their family members in Puerto Rico are okay. And seems like a great idea, but it's absolutely not what we ended up doing when we got there. So I think it was, September 27th we were in Atlanta. I did not actually go to sleep while in Atlanta because we were configuring equipment all night because we had these big sets of equipment I'll talk about in a minute, and it all needed to have software loaded on it. So that's what me and another guy basically did all of that. That's us doing it. I'm that guy. I didn't have a beard then. I stopped shaving when I went to Puerto Rico, and I got my beard back afterwards. So all these black boxes are the boxes that we actually had the equipment in. Up there, this all equipment was donated by DX Engineering, and they actually made that happen in like 2 days. I was really impressed. Like somebody I'm not used to this level of performance from the ARRL. But man, they were organized about this. Like the equipment was actually shipped to Newington, and then the guy in Newington called us and said it's all coming air freight like tomorrow, in the afternoon. And so they had gotten all this stuff together. So basically, every kit, there was one kit for every one of us, which turned out to be too many. We didn't actually need that many, but there was one kit for every one of us, and it had an ICOM IC7200 in it. And then there was a separate kit, and there was an antenna and a tuner and power supply and we put in some more rope and tools and stuff like that because we figured we might not be able to get all that stuff in Puerto Rico, so that we could put the antenna up. And then there was a box of these 2 meter only 7-watt HTs that we took with us. And I think the only reason those HTs were picked is because they were more than 5 watts. It was the only radio that they probably had that was more than 5 watts. Those things actually worked pretty well. The one thing that was missing that we would have really loved to have more of is mobile radios. But it turns out the Red Cross made a mistake and had some mobile radios in Puerto Rico, and I was able to find them, which turned out to be really, really important, actually later on. So we ended up on a charter flight. It was a JetBlue. JetBlue donated the flight to take us to Puerto Rico. There were 155 of us on the flight, of which 22 were hams, or 20 were hams. When we got there, we met the first local ham, who is this guy in the middle here. He's a Puerto Rican ham. He's the ARRL section manager for Puerto Rico, KP4RF. Kind of a cool call sign in there. And he came over to the Baptist church where we were all staying. That was the Red Cross staff shelter, because they had they picked us up from the airport. It took several hours to get out of the airport because they had to organize a big convoy of lots of cars, which was a whole other problem. But they got us to, they took us to this Baptist church, and that's where everybody was going to sleep for the first night. It turned out that's where we were for about 10 days. The first 10 days we were there. Because there were the hotels, there was like 1 or 2 hotels that was actually working, but the FEMA guys had all those. And they were up on the north side of the city. And most of the other hotels were closed because there was no power. And there was only, they had to run their generators 24 hours a day to stay open, basically, and that's expensive, so most of them were closed. And there were no tourists in the island, right? The tourists had mostly all left by the time this happened, or by the time we got there. So this is us meeting Oscar, and of course he had his complete different idea of what he wanted us to do when we were there. This is one of the things that's really weird about deployments, is that everybody has an idea of what they want you to do, and it's unclear who's actually in charge and can make those kinds of decisions. So we ended up doing kind of a little bit of everything that we want to do, because there was one of the problems is we were actually Red Cross, right? We all had to become Red Cross volunteers as part of going there. So theoretically, the Red Cross could tell us what to do. However, the people in the Red Cross largely didn't know what to tell us to do. So they mostly didn't, right? And so Oscar knew some stuff that needed to get done. So we did some stuff for him. And then we ended up, what basically happened was we ended up being 3 groups. There was a small group that stayed in headquarters that actually ran a net there. There was a group that another guy was in charge of, but it ended up being me in charge of it, which was the group that actually did reunification, which was teams that went in the field every day and mostly came back to San Juan every night. And then there were a few people who were there was another group of people that was actually deployed to locations for several days at a time in order to provide local communication. There was also the electric company wanted people to be deployed to their area because they couldn't talk to their guys when they were out there trying to repair the power system either. So it was kind of a mess, right? This is a picture of the headquarters for the Red Cross. This was a office suite that they'd moved into this office suite like 2 or 3 days before we got there. It was in the Telemundo building. Telemundo is a big Spanish language television network. And they had really good generator power, and they had air conditioning. This was the only, when I was first there, this was the only building in Puerto Rico we had that air conditioning on in the building. So they had a great building, and so the Red Cross moved over there pretty quickly. The radio area, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, is way down here at the end of this. The rest of this, like all this stuff over here, is like Red Cross logistics in there, and then there's some other the registration stuff going over here, and then there's about another. The rest of the room is about as big as this, but behind me when I took this picture, and that was mostly like where the materials are and the people who check stuff out and that sort of thing. But these guys up here were the ones that were planning where they were sending box trucks with relief supplies for towns and stuff like that. And this table was actually the reunification guys who were actually trying to figure out who we should go look for in reunification. So one of the first things we had to do, this is the discussion of what were the missions, right? The first mission was run a net in ARC headquarters so that people outside could talk to the Red Cross. Right, we had to actually do that because otherwise it was very hard to get in touch with the Red Cross. They had their own radio equipment, but there were very few people who actually knew how to use it. And it was mostly 6-meter simplex or 42 megahertz type stuff. And it was mostly simplex because they didn't have any repeaters on 42 megahertz in the country. They did bring one with them, but they didn't know where to put it. So that went up long after we left, I think. In there. So we did an amateur radio net that actually covered most of the island eventually. So that you could be pretty much anywhere on the island in 1 or 2 hops you could get a message back to San Juan, which actually turned out to be really helpful. The fixed location stuff was, like for instance, those islands that were offshore, we had to send operators out to those islands with HF equipment so that they could talk back to San Juan because there was no working telecommunications of any kind to those islands. And they had, as a matter of fact, one of the incidents that got written about on the ARRL website occurred on one of the islands where they had a person who was injured refueling a generator. The generator exploded, and a person that was actually pretty badly injured. And the guy we sent out there happened to be a fireman he was a fireman for some district like in Louisiana, I think. And so he actually had to call San Juan and say, you need to send a helicopter right now to get this person. Because fortunately there was a doctor there who could treat the person once they got to him. But the woman needed to be evacuated from the island in the middle of the night. And they eventually sent a medevac helicopter out there to get them. And the only reason that would have happened is because this guy was able to call back to San Juan and get it. Because all those kind of expensive resources like helicopters and stuff like that were all controlled out of San Juan when we were there. And so the other thing was the field work with reunification teams, which was a big activity for the Red Cross. But the first thing we had to do was put some antennas up. So that we're putting up. One of our guys is putting up VHF antenna right there, and that was our 40-meter HF antenna, 40-meter dipole being put up on the roof, because we were on 40 meters more or less continuously during the entire time we were there, and we checked into the Saturn net, which is the Salvation Army's communications net. The Red Cross no longer has an HF communications net of any kind. However, the Saturn guys, they knew we were going there because the ARRL told them or something. And so we checked into the Saturn net and said, "Are you guys in Puerto Rico?" And they said, "Yeah, we're in San Juan." And they said, "Okay, well, we'll leave they left a spot at the top of every hour, so if we needed to check in and get something or get a message in and out of Puerto Rico, we could, it was like 5 minutes at the top of every hour where we could get on their net and do it." And they actually ran the net most of the time we were there. So that was our actually operating position up here. That's two of our operators. We had this little table in kind of like what used to be a little closet, I think, before it turned into the radio room. Which was right on the edge of headquarters, which was really convenient because when I was in the field, I would call these guys and say, "You need to go get this guy to go tell them, give him this message," and they could walk back into the other part of the room and get it. So it's really important that the radio communication was actually close to the rest of the Red Cross. That worked out pretty well. They already had a VHF station there, but they needed the Oscar, the previous guy, had already been working on getting antenna runs done and stuff like that in this building, but we finished it, so we got the whole station up in about 24 hours. So one of our guys went to the field. These pictures are actually from him, and this is in Mayaguez, and Mayaguez is way on the western side, sort of southwestern side of the island. It was an area that had a lot of flooding during the hurricane, but not quite as much wind damage in there. So we sent, this was, I think the second week we were there was when he went out there. And so one of the problems we had was we were sending people out there to places we didn't have any communications with. So there were a lot of rumors about what was going on. in different parts of Puerto Rico. So at the beginning, when we sent people out in the field, we only sent 2 people together. We would send a 2-man team out there, which actually kind of goes along with what the Red Cross does. The Red Cross always says you have to be 2 people together when you do something because they don't want people going missing, which is a good thing. So we did that, and then after a little while, because we only had 22 hams, right? So after a while, we wanted to send single-man teams out. And so what we did was the fire department in Puerto Rico said, okay, whoever ran the fire department there, I don't remember, I saw the guy, but I don't remember who it was, said, okay, the fire stations will be safe places for your radio operators to go. So if they're in a random town and they have any kind of a problem, they should just go to the fire station, right? And they'll actually let them stay in the fire stations. And so that's what this guy did, is he was actually living in the fire station there. And that fire station actually had a TS-2000, which is that little radio way at the corner there, already there, but they didn't have an antenna anymore because of the hurricane. So he put his antenna up on the roof, but he used their radio that was already there. These are some pictures that he took of what's going on in Mayahuez. His main mission was to provide communications back to San Juan. I eventually ended up talking to him in the field because he was also active on a local repeater that had come back up. And so when we were in Agadia, which is a little bit north, probably 30 miles north of there, 30, 40 miles north of there, I could get on a repeater, and he came up on the repeater and said, well, I can't talk to San Juan, but I need somebody to send a message to San Juan. Can you do that? And he says, yeah, I have HF here. When the mayor of Agadia said, you need to send us water right now, this guy actually got the message in Mayahuez, and he sent it back on his HF equipment to San Juan. And then he called me back 10 minutes later and said, yeah, okay, they got it. They said they're going to do something about it. So that was kind of handy. This is an example of what happens when a 130-mile-an-hour wind hits a concrete utility pole. It does not stay standing. You notice that this one down here did. But this one came down. This was an extremely common sight in Puerto Rico, was electricity poles and stuff and transformers and stuff laying all over the roads. This stuff probably started off on the road and got kicked to the side by people doing traffic. The other picture up here is a state highway that's actually been completely washed out by a flood. We saw that in a few places too, where the road would just be completely undermined and collapsed, and there'd be this giant crater where there used to be a road. Very important not to drive around at night, because you can fall right into one of those. Because there weren't a lot of them that were blocked off with like highway dividers and stuff until later, right? So, the other thing is there were often trees and stuff on the right and left side of the road, so you'd be driving along and all of a sudden there'd be a tree in front of you, and you better be able to stop when that happens. So the last thing that we did was called reunification. So what does reunification do? This is a big thing in the Red Cross, actually. This is one of the things the Red Cross tries really hard to do once they get into an area. There are basically 2 things they do. One is the thing that we were originally sent to Puerto Rico to do, which is to register people for that safe and well system, which is done with this form, which is available in English and Spanish, and probably other languages, but in Puerto Rico we had them in English and Spanish. Basically, you write all this information down about the person, and then it gets uploaded to a website. There was a bunch of people. We were actually taking pictures. The reason I have these is because I was taking pictures of these forms and emailing them to an address in the United States, and there was a bunch of volunteers there who were typing them in to a website and sending them.
How were you able to email?
Because I did that back in headquarters. If it turns out, originally they wanted us to use WinLink to do this, and they had it set up so that we could upload, we could send email via WinLink, which is basically HF. I don't know if you don't know what WinLink is, it's HF email, more or less. There are gateways, and you can get into the gateways either by telnet, over the internet, by packet, to VHF packet, or by high frequency. And people on boats use it a lot because they don't have any other options other than HF to get to a node. And there's stations all along the coast of the United States. So when they were connecting out of headquarters back to, there was a time when we didn't have any network at all. When they were initially connecting, they were connecting to stations in like North Carolina Louisiana and places like that, and uploading stuff. But it was really painfully slow to do that. So as soon as the network came up, the guys in headquarters were doing this. Now, one of the problems was we only had HF equipment in the field. So if we knew this was going to be a problem, what we would have done is we would have set up a packet relay or something in San Juan or on one of the repeaters and then relayed the stuff by VHF packet, which is much faster than HF. When you're actually sending these files over HF, you're sending somewhere between 150 and 300 baud effective rate, generally, because the band conditions were not good coming out of Puerto Rico. There were people on adjacent channels, and it was kind of a nightmare. So you couldn't actually, the modems couldn't actually switch to the high rates, so that they would do 600 or 1200 baud. So you were always stuck down in there in the 150 to 300 baud range, which is really painful when you're trying to send something, because the other thing is the connection might just vanish while you're actually doing it, right? So the other thing that reunification does is this is kind of the upload direction, like from the disaster area to the rest of the world. The other side here is the download direction. This is somebody has gone to the Red Cross or called the Red Cross, or in particular case, a senator's office sent a list of people to the Red Cross that are looking for family members they haven't been able to contact in Puerto Rico. Usually these were people who had some medical issue. Not always, but the ones that got bubbled to the top were the ones who, like, this person's a diabetic, or this person needs dialysis, or one person we found was a quadriplegic who was staying who was living in Puerto Rico, and their family hadn't heard from them. And so those get downloaded to teams that go out into the areas and they try to find these people and find out whether they're alive, well, whether they need medicine. And sometimes, if we had a satellite phone with us, we'd actually let them call back to their relative in the U.S. And did that. We did that a couple of times for them. And so EWIs were actually a big part of what we did in the field. So this is all stuff that I did. These are all places I went. This is in the mountains up in Cayey province. The giant tree there is actually leaning on another tree, so it's not actually about to fall. This was actually a game preserve, or a kind of a wilderness preserve that's up in the mountains there. It apparently was beautiful at one time. In there. This is someone's house. This is actually not very far from the other picture, actually. And this is a very common scene in Puerto Rico. That is a house that is flooded. So what happens is people put all the stuff that's been damaged by the flood out in the front yard of the house. So you have a house there that you can see there's some damage on this end of the house here, but mostly his roof vanished on that house, which is why the water went in the house. And then these are, this was a little further south in Cayey province, and these are houses that are completely destroyed. This particular house has about 6 feet of roof left, and then the rest of it, there was a house directly to the left of this that the house looked perfect. You could look down the hill, you could see the floor, and you could see all the appliances and stuff like that, and it looked just like the house was normal, except there were no walls and no ceiling, and no roof on that house. So you were looking straight into it. It looked like a dollhouse you were looking into. And that was common, right? There were probably thousands of houses that were destroyed that way in Puerto Rico. This is on the west side of Puerto Rico. This was another area where we were looking for shelters when we were in this area. This is an area where the houses were actually damaged by wind, but then by flood. She is pointing at the area at the height of the flood waters. That line there that she's pointing at is the highest the water went in that house. So you can see it was almost to the ceiling in there. This is more, here's how you creatively destroy the power system in your country. That is a utility pole. That's the crossbar for the utility pole there. And of course, there's all this wiring hanging everywhere. There's another concrete one. This was right next to the church we were in San Juan, actually. This one is around the corner from that other flooded house that we had, where you can see this was very common. Like the poles would be like way pushed over, and they'd all be pushed over the same way, because that's the direction the hurricane wind was in that area. And then the other problem is when you were driving along here, you got to get underneath that stuff in order to get down the road, right? There's all those wires hanging, there's a pole on this side of the house, a pole on this side of the road, and the wires are all about this high off the ground, right? So a really common thing was like you reach out of the car window, you push the wires up, you get the car underneath, and you keep going down the street. Now, none of that stuff had any power, so we all felt pretty fearless doing that after we'd been there a week or so. Puerto Rico has beautiful churches. They are gorgeous. The churches are the best things in Puerto Rico. These are all, and what's more, they're right in the center of the town. You can drive to the center of the town. You are guaranteed there is a square there, and there's a church on that square. It's probably a Catholic church. Not always, but 90% probably a Catholic church. The really cool thing about that, the church always has a big open area in front of it. It's a great place to put a truck to distribute stuff. So one of the things we did when we were looking for people in a town, or we were looking for locations to send distribution to, we would drive to the center of town, find the church, and check that location out first. And then usually check out the police station for the town. And one of those two places we could find almost anybody in the town. It was actually really magical how well that worked. There's a town called Florida in Puerto Rico. This is the church in the center of its town. I thought it was particularly arty because they have the St. Joseph standing up here like that. It's very cool. One of the things we did that was actually different, and that apparently this is the first time the Red Cross has done this, they have this concept as information as aid. An awful lot of the people in a country like this that's been cut off from the rest of the world are trying to get to Facebook to tell their friends that they're okay. And Skype and things like that, right? So there were two experimental teams that had brought small aperture satellite dishes, which that is one of them right there. That's a 1.2 meter dish. They had brought small aperture satellite dishes with them. And what they do is they take that thing, they hook it up to a router, and then they have a little pole. It's got a bunch of Wi-Fi hotspots on it. That generates like a 200 or 300 meter diameter circle that has Wi-Fi and connection to the rest of the world. This didn't actually work all that well when we first got there. It took them a couple of tries to get it to work because the company that was building it was kind of a new thing. But eventually they got to the point where they could drop one of these in a location and they'd have over 1,000 people connect to one of them. And it created a traffic jam. Like this particular one was in a town called Nuabo, which is way out on the eastern end of Puerto Rico, and we were in a shopping center parking lot. And so what we did is we set up at the corner of the shopping center, and the streets on both sides were like big streets. It was like a big intersection, kind of in a newer part of town, and those streets became filled with cars within like 30 minutes. People were just stopping in their cars and like they'd say, "Oh, we got Wi-Fi! Oh, great! Let me get on Facebook." Right? And some of them would come up in the parking lot and we'd show them how to do it because they also had like chargers for phones and things like that up there in case their phone was dead. And this thing ran off of two generators. There was one generator that actually ran the satellite dish and the router, which is kind of this cable that goes in the back right behind me. That's where the router is. And then there was another one that ran all of the charging stuff and the Wi-Fi access points. Pretty cool. You'll see this more in future disasters. So what's it like to actually be deployed to Puerto Rico, or to be deployed with the Red Cross? This is like you as a person, what's it like? Well, it's not always a day on the beach, but it was occasionally a day on the beach because it was Puerto Rico and they're great beaches. We ended up staying in a destroyed hotel in Rincon, which is on the western side of the island. That the owner of the hotel, like there were 3 buildings in the hotel. The main building was not destroyed, but the 2 expansion buildings were destroyed by the hurricane. But he reopened the hotel for disaster workers to stay there. And so the second floor was all Army people, and then the third floor was us. When we were staying there, because we stayed overnight because it took so long to get to the western side of the island that driving back and forth to San Juan wasn't practical, so we stayed over there, which was actually kind of cool, because this was literally the hallway at the end of my, I walked outside my room, turned left, and this was the view. So I'm going back there. I now know all the good places in Puerto Rico to go, right? But Rincon is great, right? The beaches are awesome. The sunsets are great. It's totally awesome if it wasn't destroyed by a hurricane. And in a year or two, maybe it won't be anymore. So this is the first place we stayed, which was that Baptist church I told you about earlier. The pew right in front of that, at the beginning of this picture, is where I slept for the first 3 nights there, because they didn't have enough cots they were putting all the Red Cross people there, so they were just, there were basically convoys of people showing up, and Red Cross people would jump out. And I think we had about 200 people in this church. This is actually the sanctuary of the church. I talked to the pastor, and I was like, wow, it's like really nice that your congregation gave up the sanctuary of your church for 3 weeks so that the Red Cross could just use it. And he was very happy about that. But I'm also a Baptist, so it helped. So they have a generator for this. This church had its own generator, but they didn't have enough fuel for it. So basically, the generator would be on for 4 or 5 hours. Which was good because those fans up on the ceiling would be running when the generator was on, which made it much more tolerable to be inside the church. They had air conditioning too, but the generator wasn't big enough to run the air conditioning. The one problem with this location was it was a little bit noisy because you had 200 people in a room this size. And the other thing is there were only 2 showers. So I got up at 4:10 every morning to go take a shower. And that meant I got to take a shower. And there was no hot water either. But cold water in Puerto Rico isn't really cold, so that's not as bad as you think, right? So when you're on a team, you get deployed, you're on a team. The one thing that's true, at least if your team is the Red Cross, people who go into the Red Cross are not technical, by and large. Right? There's 10% of them maybe that are technical, and there's some groups in the Red Cross that actually are just for technical people, like to run the IT stuff and things like that. But by and large, the people you will meet on your team are not technical, which means you as a radio amateur are the technical guy on your team. Which means anything that's broken, they'll ask you to fix it. As a matter of fact, random civilians will ask you to fix things. Like I had a guy walk up to me on the street and say, hey, the power came on in my house, but it's only 120 volts, not 240, because one of the wires is off on the pole. Can you go fix that? And I said, well, first of all, your electric company wouldn't let us go do that. And second of all, I'm pretty sure, I know what the problem is, and I know how to fix it, but I'm pretty sure climbing that pole is not in the job description for the Red Cross. So we can't actually do that. But we'll talk to the power guys who are right down the street that we saw coming in here. And so we got them to come back and fix that guy's power. But it is running. As the technical guy, you will get weird requests. All of the equipment you'll be using will probably be unfamiliar to you. One of the things we ended up doing was that was really important was while we were in Atlanta, we cached the Google Maps for all of Puerto Rico while we were sitting in the airport, and that turned out to be incredibly useful because maps, Puerto Rico, those are not concepts that belong in the same sentence. And addresses and Puerto Rico are not concepts that belong in the same sentence. They have 5 different ways a house might be addressed there, including my personal favorite, which is Box 52 and a street and a neighborhood name, a barrio. So Barrio Ramirez, Box 52. Right? What that means is there's a neighborhood which might have 1,000 houses in it, or 500 or whatever. You have to get there to that neighborhood, and then you have to ask around for the family name, and there's probably a mailbox with 52 written on the side, if it hasn't worn off. And that's how you find that guy. And we did that a dozen times, right? We got really good at all the different ways you could address a house in Puerto Rico. But it's not like here in that. The other thing that's true is, which kind of alludes to that, is you're on a team, you're the communicator, but you're on a team with a bunch of other people. You can actually do the work the team does if you know how, right? So none of us have been trained in any of the Red Cross stuff, so all the stuff was new to us when we got there. But by the second or third day we were out there, we were actually filling out the forms and doing stuff and looking up addresses for the next contact and all that kind of stuff like that, because we're actually really we kind of learned the system while we were doing it. The other thing is, because you're on a team, the team's probably not that big. You'll probably be accompanying people out when they wander around and trying to do stuff, right? So one of the things that you should do, because you're likely to be more conscious of this than the Red Cross people are, is think about safety. Think about where people are going. Think about what they're doing. Think about who's wandering off alone. We actually had a sort of an incident where 2 people wandered into somebody's house to talk to a patient, and then the people in there said, "Oh, can you go to this other house and talk to this other person?" And that happened like 2 or 3 times, right? So the rest of us are sitting out in the car, and they said, "Hey, where are these people? They've been gone a half an hour at this point." And we went back to the original house; they weren't there, and it was like, "Oh my God, this is bad," right? So we got one of our Spanish speakers to say, you're going to take us to these people right now, right? Like, where are they? And so we followed the chain, and we eventually found our people. We're in like the 4th house, about 6 blocks away, in there. But we hadn't seen them come out because they gone out the back door, and that was a bit of a panic, right? Because you're in an area that you're completely unfamiliar with. Right? So after that we had a rule that said if you go into a house and you're going to be there more than 5 minutes, you take a radio person with you. Because there were 2 of us with the team at that time. And so you take one of us with you so that we can know where you are. Right? This is actually the team I was on for most of the time I was in there. This is a barbecue restaurant that was in the area we were. We would meet here at lunchtime in order to do our paperwork and get together. Also, my birthday party was in this place because the 6th day I was in Puerto Rico was my birthday, and so we had a birthday party there. So this is a typical team. Most of these people are pretty young. Actually, the person here is actually from El Dorado Hills, so she's right around the corner from here. She might have come here tonight, but I suppose she couldn't come. But most of the people who are in Red Cross teams are pretty young, as you can tell from this. I was clearly the old guy on this team. Although Vince, the guy in the back here, was almost the same age as me. So the other thing that's actually, you have to be a little delicate about this, there are a lot of strong personality types that you will run into in the field. And they're in the field, so they're all really stressful. They're all really stressed out. And there were some pretty serious personality conflicts between different sets of people out there in the field. And so you kind of got to be flexible and be able to try to put it aside and not get into a pissing match with other people on your team. You have to let the team leader actually lead the team. Although, because the team leader probably hasn't done this before, like in some cases you'll get an experienced team leader. Like that happened a couple of times on the teams I was on. But like the person that was the team lead of the team that I spent most of my time on had been with the Red Cross as a volunteer for like 5 months before this happened. And so they had done the team leader training, but that's it, right? They'd never actually been in the field with the team. And so, you have to deal with that situation kind of delicately because you might actually know if you have experience. Like I've been a manager for 20 years before this happened, so I kind of like understood some things that were going on that she probably didn't. But you got to kind of like get her in the corner and say, hey, you got to like, here's what's going on here, and you could try this, that might work. And you got to like let the person lead their team, right? So be helpful, don't be overwhelming, right? We did have a ham that actually got into a huge pissing match with his team and ended up actually we had to reassign him a couple of times to find him something he was good at, but that does happen. So you don't want to be the turkey on your team. And this is a real turkey. Well, the person who owned the turkey was one of the people we had to find. And this was on top of a mountain in central Puerto Rico. And they had these giant turkeys walking around, and so I had to take a picture with the turkey. It's great. And there's one of my favorite pictures from Puerto Rico. The guy sitting on the roof of the box truck pushing the wire out of the way so that they can get the distribution down to that town out there. But it's all about teamwork, and we did manage to get things done, and the Red Cross has been fairly successful there. in Puerto Rico. But it was certainly a lot different than any of us expected when we went there. So there you go. Questions?
Yeah. All right. Two quickies. One, your 40-meter antennas, you set them up for NVIS? The antennas, set them up low?
Well, when you actually go in the field, you're going to end up setting them up low. And the reason why is because there was nothing standing that was high enough to get them really out. On the roof of the building, we actually had a tower. Right, that was a 6 or 7 floor building, so we were pretty far above the ground there. But in all the fire stations and stuff like that, they were like right above the roof. Yeah. Generally, we wanted to get back to San Juan with those antennas because if we could, the voice network on 40 meters was much more useful than the WinLink was. Because the guys there could actually type the stuff into WinLink and send it over the internet because after the first couple of days, we had a satellite uplink at that building.
Number two, on your handhelds, would you find it, would you say recommend using one that has AA batteries?
Those all had AA batteries.
Oh, they did. Okay.
Those are the only kind of batteries we took with us.
Okay.
Yeah, and because we could, now amusingly enough, we ended up going to Walmarts and stuff like that. We took a ton of batteries in those boxes that we shipped out there, but we went through those pretty quickly. And so we were like raiding Walmarts for batteries. But fortunately, there were like drugstores and Walmarts and stuff like that that were open in different, like there was a big Walmart in Bayamon that we used to stop by every morning on the way out, and we'd buy water and stuff like that because the Red Cross didn't have water for us to distribute in a lot of cases. So we just fill up the back of the truck with stuff we got at Walmart. Yeah, behind you.
Joe, I'm curious. You know, Red Cross was a major portion of the relief effort, as was FEMA. Could you kind of compare how those two agencies or those two different groups work? Did which one you think was most effective?
Well, they do completely different things. When we were down there, FEMA was mostly concerned with registering people to get FEMA assistance. So if your house is damaged, you can go sign up with FEMA and they will eventually write you a check to fix your house, right? And so that's mostly what FEMA was doing when we in the field where we got them, is they were telling people you need to register by some date in the future. I think it was the end of the year or something like that to get FEMA assistance. They also had some like water distribution and stuff like that was going on. But the Red Cross was mostly concerned with distributing relief supplies. So they would drive up with that truck that's up there, right? One of those trucks would show up in a town, and they would set up a bunch of tables, and literally a line would form, and people could go through and get one of each thing that they had.
What about the military? It's the military.
Yeah, the military generally was not. Mostly was not distributing relief supplies to the public. They were mostly dealing with problems that the public couldn't deal with, like roads that were blocked. The Corps of Engineers was down there, and the military provided a lot of transport for them. And then the Navy, there was a big dam that had cracks in it that they were releasing water from, and that sort of thing. That was Corps of Engineers again. And then the military was taking hospital patients and flying them out to a hospital ship that was offshore of San Juan. So we didn't actually see that much of the Army out there, although occasionally we run into them in the field. They were doing some specific thing in some place. But generally, if it wasn't like immediate life injury, the military was not involved.
But really, the Red Cross was the main.
It was probably the main distributor of relief supplies, and the government itself. Right, the government is like, for instance, one of the things that's really different about Puerto Rico than other disasters is the Red Cross did not run shelters for Puerto Ricans. Normally, the Red Cross shows up and they run shelters, and people go to the Red Cross shelters. But Puerto Rico's government was running all the shelters. They had a shelter system. It was some private company, pseudo public-private partnership or something like that, that was running shelters in school buildings, which had the advantage of being relatively well-constructed buildings, which had generators. They don't have to. Yeah, no, the schools had nice generators. A lot of the ones we saw had really nice generators. They didn't have fuel for their generators in many cases, but they did have generators. Way in the back, you've been very patient.
With respect to federal EMAT somebody I know, if there's an interest in some later time, I can ask. I have a friend that was down there for 2 months under federal email, and was on that hospital about a second ago. He was there during the hurricane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was down there. He went down originally to Houston, and then got redeployed down to Puerto Rico just prior to it hitting. So that's one thing to consider. Also, with respect to the military, they were actually involved with food distribution. If you go to NPR website, go to All Things Considered for October 11th, there's a story. The military took food distribution and supplies into the city towns outside there. They would not give them to the mayors because the mayors would disappear and stuff.
We actually ran into a strongman in one of the provinces in Puerto Rico who wanted the Red Cross to drop all the supplies off at his warehouse.
Right. The military was told flat out by the government, we will handle the distribution equitably.
Yeah. We were in one town where the military had actually distributed a lot of stuff. It was one of those towns that got flooded initially, and it was probably the Corps of Engineers was there with a big operation because they had a lot of they had to like fix some bridges and stuff like that, so they had to clear a whole bunch of roads in that area. And the military ended up in that area distributing food, but we did not generally see the military distributing food when we were down there. Although we did hear in a couple of places that had happened in the past. Yeah.
Is there anything like races or areas in Puerto Rico, and to what extent were other amateur radio or native amateur radio operators able to assist in communication?
Well, they were actually pretty helpful. That guy I showed you was the section manager, but there were probably a couple of dozen other hams that we talked to on the air. They were putting up repeaters, or re-putting up repeaters. And so over time, VHF coverage on the island got much better. It was there. So like when we first started there, when we first got there, there was only simplex VHF from a site that the power company controlled that was up on a hill about 10 or 20 kilometers south of San Juan. And they had maybe 40% of the country. So what you do is you'd give the message to the guy up there, and then he'd repeat the message to the guy in San Juan. So it was a simplex repeater with a human being the thing. And the human generally only spoke Spanish. So that was half duplex and in another language. So that was exciting. Fairly shortly after, a repeater at a similar site to that came up, and we used that whenever we were within range of that repeater. Sometimes we'd actually have to, say, go drive up to the top of that hill over there, and then I can hit the repeater and get into San Juan. And so we were pretty successful with that. We could probably be 40, 50 kilometers from San Juan up in the mountains and get back to the headquarters in real time. And then there were other repeaters that were up that you might be able to reach one of our deployed amateurs who had HF or something like that with San Juan. So the local amateurs were doing a pretty good job of getting their repeaters up online. And FEMA even shipped in a repeater that we saw in the FEMA building, but it wasn't deployed yet. They were going to deploy it on the eastern side of the island so it would cover the U.S. Virgin Islands as well as part of Puerto Rico, because the Virgin Islands don't have any hills or don't have any mountains, right? So they can't they don't have like good places to put repeaters and stuff like that. So, but they're within range or within VHF range of Puerto Rico. Over here.
Are the repeaters for disaster like this, are they left open without PL?
Yeah, actually, that was kind of an interesting thing. Is that all the repeaters there had PL except one, I think, but they were open. You could use them, right? And you'd hear mixed English, and like the Puerto Rican amateurs were really good about the fact that you'd get on their repeater and you'd be speaking English, and they would actually get out of the way for you to do that, because you'd hear people speaking Spanish, and then you'd say, "Hey, I need to talk to San Juan, right? Can someone let me do that?" And they were really good about doing that. And the other thing that was really strange is every time you'd go to a police station, you'd see a guy standing outside with a Baofeng. And the reason why is because all of their internal radio networks were down, and they were using 14652 as their 911 channel. So if you wanted an ambulance, you would get on 14652 and call that guy at the police station who would have the ambulances sitting right there, and would send one to you.
That's cool.
And so I saw that happening. Like, you'd see the guy with the 8-watt Baofeng, like clipped to his breast. You see some guy who looked like a soldier or something like that, standing there with a Baofeng, and that was his communication system. Behind here.
Yeah, a couple of questions, Joe. One is, could you have used more amateurs? Second question is, was there coordination between, following up on this guy's question back here, between RACES and the Red Cross amateurs? And were any amateurs placed with the power companies? Having gone through something similar back a number of years ago, we had a bunch of power companies together trying to repair a disaster. Their radios couldn't talk to each other, so we ended up putting amateurs in with the power companies, so the power companies could all communicate.
Yeah, we didn't have anybody who got assigned to a power company. We could have used more people because we used to have to keep moving people around to whichever town had the highest need. And so, because like one of the problems that was a kind of a big issue is if you're running a hospital. Well, when we got there, every hospital in Puerto Rico was running on its generator. Those are backup power systems. They're not designed to be, it's not like a utility, right? It's not designed to be run 24 hours a day forever to run your building, right? It's really designed to be run for, until your utility power comes back. But in Puerto Rico, your utility power doesn't come back. I used to refer to it as the land after electricity. And when I was down there, so those generators would break down in the hospitals, right? And when you have a hospital that has its generator breakdown, you have to evacuate that hospital because you can't run a hospital without any power, right? People die when that happens. And we actually had an incident where I was actually on the radio with San Juan for something else. And this local amateur came up. There were local amateurs who were going to these hospitals and stuff like that. Came up on the air and says, "I need a high priority message for San Juan." And so I said, "Okay, go ahead." And he was saying, "Well, I'm at this hospital. Their generator has failed. They need like 20 ambulances to evacuate this hospital." Well, interesting problem. That message got to the Red Cross, right? Because they were talking to the guy in the radio room at the Red Cross, and so he went out right away and gave it to the guy. They couldn't call anybody back, so they didn't send the ambulances. We're pretty sure people died because of that, right? Because they couldn't, because that it turns out it was a real thing, and that hospital really needed to be evacuated, and the ambulances didn't get there till much later because they had to be called by somebody else. So that was the situation where we heard the message go over the air to them, and the guys at the Red Cross didn't send the ambulances because it couldn't verify the communication with anybody because there were no phones, right? And so stuff like that, real disaster stuff like that happens, right? And you just gotta keep going and try to make sure that doesn't happen again, right? Other questions in the back?
With 450 volunteers and only 22 got sent, but many more could have been used, where was the resource constriction for bring more people?
Well, the Red Cross was paying for us all to go.
Yeah.
Like they were we were essentially sent as Red Cross volunteers. So I'm guessing there was probably some constraint on that side. And once we got there, we were kind of heads down doing our thing, right? So we did get a couple more people come because there were people that volunteered that were going to be sent to U.S. Virgin Islands, but they actually never sent them there. So after they waited in Atlanta for a day or two, they sent them to Puerto Rico. But we never heard why there weren't more than 22. We definitely could have used, it was originally called the Force of 50. If you look on the website, the original goal was to send 50 people, but they either didn't find enough qualified people fast enough or whatever. And so they sent us and they didn't send anyone after us. Right? Way in the back.
You mentioned mobiles. How did that come
Actually, the mobiles were the only reason we could talk back to San Juan from the field. Because the problem is our HF equipment was designed, you know, like you throw the antenna over a tree and you set it up, and it takes like an hour to set up the station and all that, and it needs AC, right? We didn't have batteries, and one of the things you can't get in a place like Puerto Rico is a generator. If there's a generator, somebody already bought it in a place like that. So they were supposed to send us generators so that we could use these things in the field. Generators never showed up. Somebody else got them, I'm sure. In there, shipping things into Puerto Rico was really kind of a disaster, right? If you didn't take it yourself, you weren't going to get it in anything approaching time. So because we found out the Red Cross had by accident sent a bunch of VHF equipment to Puerto Rico, I basically went through, what I did was I went to the logistics area and I said, you've got to have radio equipment in here, right? So, oh yeah, there's a bunch of radio equipment in there. And the first thing I did was I found the 40 megahertz stuff, which didn't do us any good. But they said, but there's some other stuff too. And so we went through boxes, literally, until we found there were 8, they'd sent 8 VHF, car VHF radios. And so we basically, they had cigarette lighter plugs. Alas, they had only sent 4 antennas, but they'd sent 8 radios. So we ended up having, each reunification team got a VHF radio. And those were the way we were able to stay in touch with each other generally. Because we were in mountainous areas, hilly kind of stuff, kind of like Amador County, right? I had a lot of experience doing bike rides and communications for bike rides in Amador County, so I kind of knew what would work there. And so we literally would put people up on the top of the mountain to relay back to the repeater and stuff like that. And that actually turned out to be really useful. So if you ever do this again, you want to take a 25 watt VHF radio with you. Because if you get away from, like standing around in the city, talking to each other, 5 watts isn't going to do it. Right?
And a rolled up cable.
Well, actually, mag mounts are the right thing, right? Because you can put them in the car. You can use them when it's raining. You can use the mag mount in the car and be in the car, not outside. And it rains a lot there. Yeah.
When you left, was the situation improved enough that you felt confident in leaving there, or could they have sent another 25 people?
Well, the biggest change from when we got there to when we left was the cell sites were starting to come up. So they probably had a little more than half the country covered by working cell by the time we left. And it was clear, like that was the one thing they were making progress on, because literally there were trucks running cell towers like everywhere. You'd see guys going back and forth. You'd see like people. You drive by a destroyed cell tower, and you'd see somebody there with a truck working on it and stuff like that. And a day or two later, that cell tower would be back on the air. So they had some bandwidth up from the cell towers, and they were starting to penetrate towards the interior. They didn't have it all working, but they had half of it working by the time we were there, which was a huge difference in the 3 weeks we were there.
Just out of curiosity, would you have had a special call sign that covered what you were doing down there, or did you just use whatever your native call was?
We just used our call sign. There was a sign. There was a call sign. Kilo 1 Maria, K1M, was assigned to the Red Cross headquarters. Somebody at the ARRL did that. I don't know. We were just told use K1M. So, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering, I know that the FCC suspended certain regulations for operations during that time, such as the third-party limitations.
Yeah.
And
actually, anybody was allowed to use amateur frequencies during that time.
anybody, even without a license, because it was a question of life and death.
Yeah, that's why they were able to use, and 14652 was assigned as their emergency frequency. So we never used 14652. We use 14655 as our internal communication frequency, which most Puerto Ricans didn't seem to use, right? Because pretty much we'd never hear anybody else on there. But 14652 was their 911 frequency, and so we told all the radio amateurs stay off of it unless you're actually calling for an ambulance, right?
During the deployment, I know that there were a number of nets that were active on the on the air, like the Caribbean Weather Net had disaster relief traffic going on all the time. They're actually live streaming over YouTube. Did you have any kind of interaction with that type of activity, or were you strictly involved with the Red Cross communications?
We mostly did Red Cross. The guys at headquarters checked into the Saturn net like several times a day. So they would pass traffic back to, like most of our traffic that went to ARRL HQ went that way. But they were also able to send email after the first week. They were able to send email because there was Wi-Fi and a satellite uplink from the Red Cross building that we were in, because it was Telemundo, right? So they had giant satellite dishes in the front yard and stuff like that.
Now, had you had any other experience doing any kind of disaster relief work or public service work before you went into this this particular deployment?
Well, at one time, for 3 or 4 years, I was the emergency coordinator for Fremont, California. So I'd done kind of the coordinate with the fire department, because the fire department is the agency that owns emergency communications in Fremont. So I'd done some like administrative type stuff like that. We hadn't had a disaster in Fremont, but we'd had lots of drills for them. Fortunately, the giant earthquake that we always plan for had not happened yet at that point. And I've done a couple of small things, like go out on an exercise or go out on a drill or stuff like that. But I'd never done anything. This was the biggest disaster anybody who worked it had ever been in, because literally you have a whole country that's broken. Right, where nothing works, and it's like, okay, what are you gonna do? Well, I don't know. Let's find something and make it work, right? And that's kind of what we did, right? Is we really had to make it up as we went along.
Did you feel that prior experience prepared you well enough for this deployment?
Like the stuff I was doing with the teams, one of the reasons I picked that to do rather than the HF thing to do is because I had a lot of experience doing bike races up in the mountains. So because of having to set up, like the digipeaters and we do APRS for our bike races and stuff like that. So we set up digipeaters and locations and do voice communications with all these. And I'd been the net control to run voice communications for several of those bike races that the Amador Club does, right?
Correct.
Sierra Century and the other ones. Party. April. Beginning of April. Beautiful bike race, by the way. If you're into biking, awesome race. Because of doing that, I felt a lot more confident about being in the field with a VHF radio and being able to actually use it to do stuff. And so that was really useful, because I was clearly one of the more experienced people in doing that kind of communication. And we actually had a bunch of people who were more experienced at HF, doing HF. Like I have an HF station at home, and I've done WinLink. And matter of fact, the reason they actually picked me is because they asked us all about WinLink, right? And I'd actually built a WinLink station for somebody's boat. They said, "Oh, perfect, right, great, that works fine for me." But I didn't actually have to do very much of that stuff because I was mostly doing VHF communication. So, no more questions? Good, thank you.